Hey everyone, it's Mike from the Comic Book Trove here today with another Omnibus review, and today I'm going to be taking a look at one of what has to be said the most classic, iconic comic book runs of all time, and an excellent Omnibus collection. I'm talking obviously about the Daredevil by Frank Miller and Klaus Janson Omnibus. Now, I'm going to take a look through this book and discuss some of the run, so I'll just throw a spoiler warning out there straight away because I'm going to talk about a few of the key parts of this whole collection. Just show off the dust jacket here. It's got this very unique design amongst Marvel omnibuses, this as well as the companion omnibus, and I will take a look at that separately in another video at some point. It looks really cool, this kind of red and black design, looks very stylistic. You know, you get the back here, you get a little bit of blurb with your contents at the bottom. Yeah, really cool look, and it matches the companion really well. What is a bit of an issue, to some maybe, not necessarily to everybody, is the fact that it is so different to the overall design of other Marvel Omnibus that it really looks out of place on the shelf if you're putting it amongst other Marvel books. Now, as I say, that might be nothing at all to some people. It's a little bit weird for me, so I kind of keep it separately. This and the companion, I put them somewhere else on the shelf rather than amongst the other Marvel books, just because it stands out so much. But at the end of the day, that's obviously not a huge deal. It's all about the contents. And the contents here are certainly very good. So we open up the book, we'll take a look inside. As I say, spoiler alert, because I'm going to cover a few key things in here. There's a lot to say about this run. I'm certainly not going to say everything that can be said, but yeah, just fair warning. So when we start with the book here, we open up with issue 158. This is where Frank Miller came onto the series as the artist, and it's quite funny that he's introduced as the newcomer lanky Frank Miller down here. Of course, nobody would have thought at the time, nobody would have known or suspected, I imagine, how much of an impact this guy was going to go on to have, both on this series and the comic industry in general. But yeah, so he starts out just as the artist, working with Roger McKenzie, who's writing the early issues in this book. And it's, yeah, it's an interesting start because, you know, these aren't the strongest issues in the book, but they're by no means bad. They're actually quite fun to read, to be honest. And Miller's artwork is certainly interesting to look at through these issues and see how it starts to evolve. But I think really from the very beginning, he had a great kind of style for drawing Daredevil. It's like he had a real knack for it. You do get some cool stories featuring Bullseye coming in as the main villain. You got Black Widow, who'd had quite a long-standing partnership with Daredevil up to this point. This is kind of the back end of that, really, before she was pretty much written out of the series. But yeah, cool stuff. There's also an issue in here that features the Hulk, which is a pretty fun issue. But really, I think everybody would probably agree that this run and this book in particular starts to get really good. Like, it goes onto another level once Frank Miller starts writing it as well as drawing it. At that point, it's just something else. But this is that issue with the Hulk. Really cool because, you know, Daredevil, obviously a character who's massively outmatched in terms of power and strength when it comes to facing someone like the Hulk, but nevertheless it manages to be a fun story. An interesting one, to be sure. Yeah, so up to this point, this series had been really kind of flagging. It was on the verge of cancellation when you had Frank Miller coming in. Yeah, it wasn't particularly popular, and I think it's no exaggeration to say that Frank Miller and his storytelling, his writing, the ideas he brought to this series ultimately, pretty much single-handedly responsible for saving it and for steering Daredevil as a character in a series into more of the direction that we're much more familiar with the character in now, because pre-Miller, Daredevil was really a very different character to, I think, how he's most popularly known now as the kind of, that word, hate to say it, but sort of dark, street-level, you know, quite serious character, taking on organised crime, protecting Hell's Kitchen, you know, kind of guardian of the night type of thing, the devil of Hell's Kitchen, all that sort of stuff. Really comes from Frank Miller. Pre-Miller, up to this point, especially during the Silver Age, Miller had been not Miller, sorry, Daredevil had been much more of a kind of comedic series, much more light-hearted. He was like some kind of swashbuckling hero from a kind of serialized adventure stories, that sort of thing. But here with issue 168 is really where it starts to get going and get really, really good. So the introduction of Electra, I always thought it was quite interesting as well, one of those little things, a bit of trivia that the name is spelt incorrectly for Electra on the cover. Just one of those little things. Yeah, so from here you've got Frank Miller as artist and writer, Klaus Janson working on the book as inker/finisher, mostly from this point onwards. And yes, you get introduction of Electra and some retconning, therefore, of Matt Murdock's backstory, as we learn that he and Electra met in college, had quite a passionate love affair, only for it to all end in tragedy when Electra's father, who was, I think, a Greek ambassador working in America, was killed, assassinated. She basically didn't take that well, to say the least. She went down a dark path, left Matt behind, they separated, he never saw her again, and she re-emerges now, years later, working as a professional assassin. And she is awesome. I think everything about Elektra in these first issues that, you know, Miller orchestrated and designed the character, the way he developed her, it works really well. These are actually some of my favourite panels of any comic. Can't even necessarily pinpoint and tell you exactly why. It's just this sequence, her kind of overpowering the guy, this little exchange between her and Matt, only for her to be left crying in the rain. Really good. Honestly, just fantastic work. Looks amazing and almost speechless, to be honest. I really, really, really like this run. Another thing, you know, you got Bullseye again coming in here. He's also an assassin, so what Miller sets up is a kind of conflict between him and Elektra, working as, you know, competing against each other really as assassins, competing for the favour of the Kingpin, who Daredevil had never really had too many exchanges with in the past, but Miller really positioned Kingpin as being a prime antagonist, if not the primary antagonist for Daredevil, whereas he'd always kind of been an on and off again Spider-Man villain who would show up now and then, but Miller, with his fascination with you know, organised crime noir genre in general, made use of the character to great effect and made him a genuinely intimidating force for Daredevil and other heroes to periodically go up against. So the Kingpin, being the Kingpin of crime, has high quality, highly skilled assassins working for him in his employ, and he generally has had Bullseye working for him. There comes a point in here where Elektra ends up working for him, and you know, that leads to conflict again with Matt, with Bullseye. It's just a really cool story. You know, it's one of those that you absolutely must read. I think if you've got any interest in Daredevil whatsoever, you absolutely should read this book. Now, is it a great starting point? I absolutely think it is, because that's another key question, of course, that's always worth asking if you're new to a character or just don't have much familiarity with a character. Comics can be very intimidating, very daunting. You know, there's, in most cases, decades of continuity to... Can't open these pages. Decades of continuity to kind of figure out. If you come into it fresh, it can be a bit of a nightmare sometimes, but I think this run is excellent. Is an excellent place to start reading Daredevil, because this is really the start of him being that kind of street-level guardian of justice character, like Batman in a way, but without all the money. Elektra, whenever she shows up in here, she's used quite sparingly, to be honest. Like, I remember when I first read this run, she doesn't show up like every issue. She's not in every single story. She just turns up now and then. Love this opening page here, fantastic. Like Elektra in meditation kind of pose. Very awesome. And yeah, so this, you know, the relationship between these two characters is really fascinating. They kind of have this, still have lingering love for each other, but they're in different positions now. You know, life has taken them in different directions, and It's like they both want to be together, but they can't be together because they're opposite sides of the same coin now. You know, she's an assassin, she kills for money. He's Daredevil, he wants to protect the innocent. Opposite beliefs, really, but nevertheless, they still have this attraction to each other. And I just think, like, well, I suppose it comes from, again, one of Frank Miller's other tropes, his other fascinations that he's used recurringly in his work is Japanese culture, specifically like ninja. Ninjas do feature heavily in this this storyline and this whole work. Elektra herself is kind of a ninja assassin, and there's this organisation which nowadays I think is quite well known amongst Marvel fans called the Hand, who are a kind of secret organisation of ninjas as well. And they were introduced in here. So yeah, a lot of ninja type stuff going on, as you can see recurringly through these pages. Somehow it all works really well when put together. Yeah, just it's like cool page after cool page. Honestly, this is a run I really can't say enough good things about. I think like Miller back in the 80s, like when Miller was great, he was just fantastic. You know, the stuff he did on Daredevil, Batman, Sin City, everything pretty much pre-2000 for Miller was just really good stuff. And of course, the interesting thing about Elektra as well, I feel like Elektra, for me, Elektra is the standout aspect of this whole run. Her character, her storyline, her relationship with Matt, it's the part of this run that stood out the most. It probably does to a lot of people, I think, but yeah, I can't help but talking about her because just like an immediately iconic character. The interesting thing about her is she was introduced in issue 168. And another spoiler alert here, even though I feel like this is one of the better known parts of this entire arc, but she was then killed off in issue 181, I think it is. I feel like this is the issue, actually. Try and find the cover. No, not quite yet. But anyway, yeah, so her storyline comes to an end, well, kind of, in issue 181. So she'd only been around, you know, I mean, she was killed off so soon after being introduced as this new, exciting, fun character, like, very interesting character. And here is the issue, very iconic cover, 181, Bullseye versus Electra, one wins, one dies. One of those covers that doesn't lie to you when it makes a promise like that. Just like quite grim and graphic artwork as well, you know. It's Frank Miller at the end of the day, so quite mature storytelling. I mean, this was the early 80s. I mean, this is before people like to talk about The Dark Knight Returns or Watchmen as being the stories that after which comics became dark and serious. Well, this predates that stuff, but I tell you, everything going on here is pretty similar thematically to that stuff. But this fight sequence between Bullseye and Elektra, really great that Miller just lets the pencils tell the story for the most part. It's a really kind of gritty fight sequence and ends with this iconic image of Elektra being impaled, stabbed by her own weapon, her sai. She then crawls, literally, back to Daredevil, to Matt Murdock, and dies in his arms. And it's, wow, it's powerful. It's emotional, man, you know. It's just, I hope I'm conveying how, even slightly, how great this story is and how much it means to me. It's just, there have not been many runs where I read them and can't put it down. You know, literally got to finish it. I read this omnibus so quickly when I first bought it years ago. Just a joy to read. You know, it's an emotional roller coaster. But if you think about Elektra, you know, she's introduced and killed off in, what, 13 issues? Pretty much unprecedented, you know, especially since she'd been such a fascinating character as well, as I say. And Miller's whole thing was he kind of had an unofficial agreement with Marvel following on from the end of this whole run, that they would they would let Elektra stay dead. You know, they wouldn't resurrect her and bring her back and use her again in stories. And obviously that didn't work out. You know, that Marvel, at the end of the day, weren't going to let a character that interesting and popular stay gone forever. So yeah, she's long since turned up again in stories, obviously. But the original intention by Miller, anyway, was for this to be the end of her whole thing. And following on from that, Matt really kind of goes off the deep end. The issues following on from that haven't really talked about these as I've looked through them, but this is where he kind of goes on a revenge quest initially against Bullseye. Almost kills him. Again, you know, he goes right up to that line of almost killing him and then just stops just short of it, barely. Kingpin, though, still featuring heavily through here. The Stilt Man, one of the most ridiculous Silver Age villains, Daredevil villains, comes into this story, and somehow Miller even makes it so this character, one of the most ridiculous characters, no doubt, is somehow interesting. You know what I mean? He still makes even that story, that character, work within this run. I always liked minimalistic covers like this. You know, this is really reminds me of the John Byrne Alpha Flight issue with Snowbird. I don't know why, they look quite cool. Stuff like that sometimes, I just think they are nice covers. That's another good example of one. So Black Widow does come back into the story, which I think we start to see here. And also, yeah, so Matt Murdock's mentor, another retcon, another part of Matt's backstory that Miller added to, was he brought in this character called Stick, who is another sort of ninja type guy, really, and a part of an organisation that's sort of opposite to the Hand, whereas the Hand is sort of evil and sinister. Stick and his crew, they're sort of trying to stop the Hand, really. Here's the Black Widow coming back in. But yeah, basically, so Stick was a mentor figure for Matt Murdock and taught him to really kind of get a handle on his powers when he was young and struggling to come to terms with his blindness and with the new, at the time, overwhelming senses that were hitting him in every other way. Yeah, so this whole story kind of culminates in a team-up between Daredevil, Black Widow, and Stick, a couple of other characters I forget the name of, to be honest, in a showdown with the Hand. And that's what's going on in these final couple of issues in here, and it's, again, just very exciting, very fun, action-packed. Great combination of fun action scenes and character development throughout this whole run, which is always a winning formula. It's not complicated, you know. If you can do something like that, tell a good story that develops your characters well and puts in a good amount of action and excitement, then you're on a winning formula, aren't you? But here's a cool bit, like next issue, Resurrection, referring to seemingly Electra. And it's kind of deliberately vague, a little bit obscure, I suppose, as to what happened, but the Hand want to resurrect Electra. They get her body. Obviously, Daredevil and the crew don't want to let that happen. So they end up... Well, the Hand are trying to do a ritual to bring her back to life, dark magic and all that. And it, well, as I say, it's left off a little bit ambiguously. She disappears, her body is gone, and then we get these final pages where a figure climbing up this kind of icy terrain, mountain, and we see Electra. No words though, no context really, nothing that 100% definitively tells you she's alive, but I think the idea is that she is. But yeah, so that was kind of the end point. I think Miller just wanted it to be left as though she's out there somewhere, but that's it for her, you know, she wasn't expected to come back. But then you get this last issue. So this is the last issue of the run, 191. and this is a really classic issue. Roulette, it's called. Frank Miller on the pencils, Terry Austin inks this one. And the entire issue is this fantastic sequence of Miller visiting the incredibly injured Bullseye in his hospital bed, and Bullseye cannot move, like he's completely paralyzed. And yeah, Daredevil's just talking to him and using this gun and playing Russian roulette with the gun, you know. Takes a shot at himself, takes a shot at Bullseye. You know, apparently there's one bullet in the gun, who's gonna go? Yeah, really tense, really cool concept for an issue. Very Frank Miller, you know. One of the most Miller comics ever. And I won't specifically say how it ends, but then in the back you get a kind of bonus what if story, this one, what if Daredevil became an agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., which I assume this is collected in one of the what if omnibuses now. I don't actually have that first volume. Yeah, and then so you get your extras in the back, but again, I mean, well, cool pencils there. An interview with Miller, Janson, but yeah, again, I've just got to say, you know, like I haven't emphasised enough up to this point, but this book, this run, is just spectacular. You know, it's one of the absolute best of all time, no doubt. It's held up really well, I think. You know, it's, what, 40 years old now, this run, there or thereabouts. And it's still excellent, absolutely excellent. Probably the best Daredevil run of all time, I think, anyway. Obviously, you can disagree with that. I know there's other great Daredevil runs in the years since this one, but I don't think any of those would have happened if it hadn't been for this one, you know. A lot of like pencils and layouts going on in the back, though, really cool to see. So overall, if you couldn't guess from the huge amounts of praise I've heaped on this book because I've talked about it, it's highly recommended by me. Now this omnibus, though, I think is out of print. I think this was the third printing of the book that I've got here. I think it's out of print at the moment. I actually don't know if there's a reprint coming out next year. I kind of feel like I've heard there is one, but I might be wrong about that, just because I feel like these days there are so many reprints and omnibus announcements compared to previous years that it's honestly quite easy to lose track of it all. But I think this collection is available in trade paperbacks, unless they're also out of print, in which case I apologise for being very out of touch. Or you could at least read it digitally. That much is a certain bet for sure. But yeah, however you can read it, if you haven't already, then yeah, absolutely do. Please check it out. You owe it to yourself if you haven't, because this is just a great comic experience. But yeah, thanks as always for watching, guys, as I've come through another review. As always, happy to hear from you. If you want to leave anything in the comments section, drop a like on the video if you enjoyed it, please. I do appreciate that very much. And yeah, otherwise I'll be back again to discuss something else soon.